Hey, how's it going out there, guys? So, a while back, I made a video talking about strategic concepts of both offense and defense, and I meant to do one on operational and tactical implications for the same thing. I did a few of them. Honestly, I did them when I was drunk. So when I watched them when I was sober, I wasn't very happy with the result. And then my computer was broken for a really long time, and I just never got back to doing it again. So it's kind of one of those things I sort of just forgot for a really long time. So I kind of thought I'd do it today while I've got some time off. So keeping with the same idea, if you remember last time we kind of talked about, like, I live around the Omaha area, I live on the Iowa side, so we kind of just use that as a, just some sort of, no context having example to use. And so we'll kind of continue with that. And so, excuse me, so talking about tactical and operational versus strategic. So if you don't know the difference between the three levels of battle, there's a lot of overlap with them, and I'm going to kind of break this down into oversimplification, so don't jump on me because it's not exactly correct. So basically the way to think of it, so starting at the tactical level is what you would call the smallest level. So it's about how to win firefights, engagements, battles, that sort of thing. The operational level is the next one. The operational level has to do with how we win battles and campaigns. And it starts to get into the terrain-specific or the theater-specific strategic concepts. The other way to think of that is operational tends to be more like the corps level and above. So a corps is multiple divisions. So what you're talking about is, probably 20 or 30,000 men and then up, operational level. And then the strategic level has to do with the grand strategy, which brings in a lot of political aspects of things like that, and then there's going to be overlap amongst all of them. Obviously, they're obviously mutually supportive, and they're all trying to get to one goal, so there has to be some overlap. But when we're talking about tactical and operational, what we're more or less talking about is how do we win battles, how do we win campaigns, all right? And then we use the campaigns to set up the support for the strategy when it comes to that. So kind of, to sort of piggyback on what we talked about before, defending the Omaha area here. And again, so why this would be important operationally and tactically. So we talked about some of the strategic stuff from an offensive and defensive standpoint. So I've got this in kind of in satellite mode here. So Omaha sits astride I-29 and I-80. So as we talked about in the strategic realm, the reason that we would have to defend this area strategically is, as you know, the Midwest, the middle of the country is where we produce the majority of the food for the country. So being able to control the actual food stores over the course of a long campaign would definitely be very important. And then we talked about, I kind of used the example of if an enemy was at either the East Coast and the West Coast and the Gulf or some combination thereof, they would have to join those two, which would be a combination of the strategic and the operational levels, because otherwise they would be forced to fight completely separate campaigns on either end of wherever that was going. So obviously you want to link those. And so these would center around the major, arteries of travel. And the reason for that, if you don't know, and this isn't me being snarky or anything like that, is obviously, military units require humongous amounts of supplies, just to sustain themselves, not only like in battle, but just to survive. You have a bunch of guys out, fighting or occupying positions or whatever. Obviously, they're not farming. They're not, they're not raising cattle. They're not doing stuff like that. So you have to feed them. You have to clothe them. You have to give them water. And then when you start talking about armored vehicles and mechanized elements, you're talking about elements that require humongous logistical support because of the huge amounts of gas it takes, the amount of ammunition it takes. Vehicles require repair and maintenance and that sort of stuff. So the reason that the interstate corridors are so important operationally and strategically is because, obviously they're extremely well-maintained roads comparatively. I know that's going to be, kind of the running joke for every place, coming out of winter right now. But if you look at America versus the rest of the world, or the Western world versus the rest of the world, we are exceptionally well off in both quantity and quality of roads. You don't have to go back into history very far at all to start talking about European campaigns or wars, battles where essentially an entire front or area of the front only has one road that can really access it. And so what that means is, kind of a famous example from history Operation Market Garden, where the Allies were, they tried to advance north upon, Hell's Highway, the Highway 101 or whatever that is, through Belgium and Holland and all that, and cross the Waal Bridge and into the Upper Rhine into Germany. They only had one road for which 30 Corps could go on, so where their armored elements and their land-based supply could go. And at a lot of points, it was only one lane wide, which means every time a vehicle gets a flat tire, every time a vehicle gets hit by, hits by a mine or a tank or Panzerfaust or something like that, and it's out, it blocks every single person. Every single vehicle has to stop. And so you got to get it out of the way, and then you keep going. Whereas the interstates, depending on where you're at, they're generally two lanes going in one direction. So you have the ability to move large vehicles, the type of vehicles that would be transporting tanks, transporting tankers, the fuel and such like that. And then even the highways, a two-lane highway, if you have cross traffic, like vehicles going opposing, they still have room to move that. So that's why those avenues are so important. So to get back to this specific area, so when it comes to the operational and the tactical level, so whenever we're defending something, you guys are probably familiar with an elastic defense or a defense in depth. And what that basically means is, I use football as an example all the time. So you look at how a defense calls a scheme in football. For the most part, they have a couple of down linemen, 3 or 4 in the NFL. They have a few linebackers, 2 to 4, kind of depending. And then they have 3 to 5 defensive backs, which means they have multiple levels covered. So they can put pressure up front for the run. They have linebackers in the middle who can go both back for pass coverage. They can come up to either if the quarterback's running or the running back's running or whatever. And then you have defensive backs who primarily cover receivers and tight ends and things moving down the field, but they can also work in on the runners. And so that gives them depth. Whereas if you ran a goal line defense, which obviously we do on the goal line, but let's say you ran a goal line defense in the middle of the field. If you happen to call the right defense, that goal line defense, into the right play and you stop him, that's great. But if the dude squirts past the line just a little bit, bam, he's gone to the end zone. Same basic idea when it comes to battle. So you don't want to bring all your defense right up to the thing you're trying to protect, because it allows the enemy to bring all of its weapons to bear on that, especially artillery in the modern realm. But it also means if they happen to penetrate, well, now you're screwed. So when we start planning a defense in depth, so obviously things like this are going to start clear over here. If you see my cursor, around Des Moines, the Des Moines River runs through here, so it's still a natural, kind of obstacle. But this is multiple hours. This is about 3.5, this is about 2.5 or 3 hours away here. So that's still a fairly large distance. And so as an enemy crosses that, what you get into is Iowa, kind of jokingly, is really flat. I'm making air quotes back here, but really it's not. Most of Iowa is, fairly low rolling hills, both sides, both here on the east or on the west and over here on the east, but also here you can see the terrain in the center. Very hilly and pretty restrictive type of hills. You've got to use the highways if you wanted to move heavy traffic or tanks and things like that around. You couldn't get away with a lot of the gravel roads at certain times of the year. So what we're going to do is, if we zoom in, so when we start the defense in depth, so now you can see the highways. All right, given that this agricultural state, these highways are all capable of handling very heavy traffic for obvious reasons. So what your defense in depth is going to start to look like is it's going to kind of have this arcing effect out here, if you can see where my cursor is. So we have like towns like Mount Ayr, Creston, Atlantic, Harlan. There's other smaller ones over here. They're astride highways and multiple highways, all right? And so we're going to put outposts there. We're going to have things like in the modern realm, we tend to use what we call MAPs or CAT teams, so mobile assault platoons or combined anti-armor teams. They're primarily Humvees. They'll have TOWs, 50 cals, Mark 19s loaded on them, and oftentimes they'll take javelins or something with them. They can move very fast. They can bring a lot of firepower to bear. They don't have a lot of staying power just because they're moving fast and they're just in Humvees. But what that means is that they'll be able to move in and out. So if you imagine, if we just kind of zoom in here and kind of come over to one of these towns that we talked about, over here, when we're looking, so let's say we're in Atlantic, so we're astride multiple highways here. So you got the interstate here, multiple highways coming through, especially Highway 71 is a really big one. So now if you have a company and you have a couple of MAP teams based out of here, they can easily cover this distance right here. So you're looking about the distance going, up to here. It's only about 20 miles. So I mean, they cover this in just a matter of minutes coming up here to mess with enemy forward elements, scouting elements, things like that. And what that's going to do is, obviously you're not going to use your CAT teams to completely stop a large push that's going to be backed up by armor, air power, artillery, and things like that. But what these do is they put pressure on an attacking force, so that they're forced to engage. Potentially they cause casualties, which slow them up, which impact their total force and their supply disposition. But also, it starts to give the shape of the enemy's intent to the commander in general. So we'd have to assume an enemy is going to make some sort of push coming down Interstate 80 here as they move west. So now as we start to use elements who are potentially based in these smaller areas, and they start to encounter these scouting elements, now they're going to start to be able to paint more of a realistic picture as far as what the enemy's actual intent is. Are they going to push their primary effort right across 80 here? Or, if we zoom back out, is going to be something more like where now they want to use Highway 71 and come over to here. Or if you come down, I forget what this highway is. It's like Highway 30 or 60 or something like that. No, that's not 30. I think it's Highway 60 or some shit like that. Whatever, it doesn't matter. But no, kind of seeing where their main effort is. And just what their disposition is. So that's going to be huge. So we start to, the term is sometimes called shouldering, which means when an enemy attacks something, in the modern realm, because armored forces and mechanized forces can move so far and so fast, it's not so much about stopping them right at the point of attack. It's about dissipating their strength and sort of directing them into areas where they're more defensible. So instead of giving them the easy access to the interstate and the towns here, now you start to maybe direct them down into the highways or the smaller roads, these county roads, these county highways over here, where it's much less easy for them to maneuver. But also now you're talking about, you're probably going to have supporting arms like air power, artillery, and that sort of stuff, so you can direct them into places where it's easy for them to be assaulted by those elements. As we get closer, all of those things are obviously going to start to pinch down. So you're going to have mobile artillery, and your own armored forces here in this particular scenario, because we talked about Omaha being on the Missouri River, which is a very formidable terrain feature. The Missouri is not fordable anywhere in Iowa. I don't know if it is anywhere in the country, but it's not fordable anywhere in Iowa. And outside of the cities like Omaha and Sioux City, up farther north, you don't really run into bridges. There's a bridge every 30 or 40 miles, so you definitely get channelized down into certain areas. So the other thing that we have to take into account is as we see the terrain. So pretty legitimate hill country over here. I don't know if you can really see, kind of the darker green and the darker green here, but this right here, very low rolling hills. So being able to have an enemy take a long amount of time in this area means that they're going to be very easy to prosecute with air power. So being able to use these elements that we talked about, potentially occupying these smaller towns in advantageous terrain, forcing an enemy to be in these more exposed areas right here means that they're going to be much easier to prosecute with our heavy weapons, our air power, our artillery, stuff like that. So as we start to move closer from this standpoint, the other thing that we also have to keep in mind from an operational standpoint, so we're talking larger scale than just tactical, is that an enemy is going to get channelized down here. So the enemy is going to have to start thinking about capturing ground where they can stage large amounts of units to be able to push through. So we look at just how restrictive some of this hill terrain is. An enemy is going to have to move the majority of their force through here, where they have multiple roads and a fairly large amount of open space. If a person looks up here, so this is a bridge that comes across the Missouri River right here, which is capable of handling heavy traffic. But as you can see, coming through here, the highways are pretty limited. Up in here. So these are all runoffs. You can see all these terrain runoffs here, and these hills are pretty nasty, and there's actually a pass right here, a cut right here, which is basically where I live. And so being able to, if they're coming off of the interstate or the highways, they're going to get channelized big into here. The other thing that we see in this point is, so this is the Missouri River right here, this dotted line. It doesn't show up that well on the screen, but this constitutes the Missouri River Valley, right? So everything between the hills here on the Iowa side and the hills here on the Nebraska side is just completely open, very flat, extremely fertile farmland. I mean, that's what Iowa is known for, but it's completely flat, absolutely no terrain other than dikes out there that are man-made. And other than that, it's just marshland, farmland, that sort of stuff. And then as you can obviously see, so here's bridge here. There's multiple bridges in Omaha, Council Bluffs itself that come across the river. But if an enemy was coming across and using this bridge on Interstate 680, this connection interstate bridge right here, as they come through here, they're going to be 100% exposed to the massive amount of artillery and air power that we can bring to bear in this completely open area. They can't push up to the river here and cross it. They can push up there to support, but they will have to stage and they will have to make a major movement through areas like this to be able to take this bridge. Now, I mean, there's the obvious idea that you could send smaller tactical level elements across the river in boats and that sort of stuff, and that's absolutely true. But what we're talking about at the operational level, at some point you're going to have to move your armor, your mechanized units, your supply train, your logistics through an area like this, which is going to expose them potentially big time to artillery that you can keep on the reverse slope of the hills over here. You can hide in urban environments, and the air power. So that's definitely something that's going to be humongous when it comes to that. And so again, operationally, we're talking about campaigns, we're talking about core level sort of movements and stuff like that above. So being able to move into positions here, you could use the hills here as sort of a breakwater and for protection. So being able to stage elements back here would definitely be advantageous, but there's only really a couple ways to get through here with major traffic. Infantry elements and stuff like that could come through, but you could not support major armored advances into these areas with the small country roads available here. You'd have to come in on there's a highway that's right up by here. You can kind of see here, this is a highway that comes through town, and it comes up here. And same thing, this one cuts through the hills. Very, very small road. And having seen tanks on asphalt before, I would basically guarantee tanks driving on this asphalt road would break the road, crumble the road, which would obviously lead to massive deterioration pretty quickly. But now, to kind of, not keep this video super long, but to kind of bring it a little bit full scale and bring it back, like why an enemy would need an area like the Omaha metro area in an operational sense. So we talked a little bit about strategic, we talked about the agricultural idea. Strategic, also operational. Controlling the Missouri River gives a person, if we zoom way out here, so the Missouri River runs down through here, and it cuts across in Missouri and hooks up with the Mississippi River, like way over here. I think it cuts cuts right through Kansas City and comes right across here to St. Louis. So you could control north to south traffic. So you could potentially, if you have barges and things like that and major ocean-going traffic, you could use the Gulf of Mexico. It also means you can prevent an enemy from doing the same thing. The other thing that you have to keep in mind is, if we look at kind of the geography here, once a person gets west of Omaha in this particular corridor, so you've got the Platte River, which is a major terrain feature here, but there's nothing. Eastern Colorado, western Nebraska is a fucking hellscape, and there's basically nothing out there. So from an operational standpoint, there's nothing an enemy could really be defending out here. And if you think back to World War II, we're so famous with the Germans being stopped before Moscow in 1941, and Hitler's kind of famous orders stand in place. But basically they spent the entire winter out on the steppe and completely exposed. And a similar situation would happen if we did the same thing here. So more than likely, at the operational level and the strategic level, if an enemy lost Omaha, Kansas City, places like that, they would probably have to retreat to the mountains. From a simple standpoint of leaving a large force exposed in extremely flat terrain where there's not much cover, not much to defend, not much for, just keeping them away from the weather, chances are you would take an awful lot of casualties, and you would really dissipate your force there. So that's one. And if an enemy did take this area, they would likely force an enemy to retreat all the way back towards Colorado and Wyoming, just so they could have something defensible. The other thing is, as we talked about, Omaha sits basically astride the Platte River, the Missouri River. The Platte River is super, out of control river, and kind of comes through here. So controlling that. Okay, sorry about that. My camera died in the middle, so I had to go and recharge it and delete some stuff off there. So kind of bring everything full circle. So I was talking about with, as far as the Platte River, but other reasons why operationally, the Omaha area is valuable. So we have Offutt Air Force Base is down here, in addition to Epley Airport's up here. So those could obviously, handle the heaviest air traffic that exists. I mean, the Air Force Base, obviously, they got C-5 Galaxies and crap I've seen going in down there. So not only being able to have that as an enemy, but to be able to deny that to your enemy, as we talked about just with the terrain restrictions as far as everything west of eastern Nebraska and stuff like that. So being able to control that, then realistically, now you're talking about your enemy has to come from potentially hours, or not hours, but hundreds of miles west, to be able to do anything to you, which means that you're able to then dictate a lot of the tactical airspace around around the area, around where your operations are taking place. And that's hugely beneficial for a lot of reasons. Obviously, that means you can then have your anti-aircraft capabilities in addition to your aircraft as part of your defense, working against the enemy. The enemy has to come to you, so they're wasting resources. And any plane shot down and pilots lost in that sort of scenario are, essentially going to have to be written off as losses because the enemy has to come towards you. So again, kind of just talking about some of this stuff I find interesting. If you guys have comments or anything, go ahead and leave them in the comments below the video. But remember, only the hits count, and you can never miss fast enough to catch back up.